KAISEROVA,
Este
Ambassador
normal
of
să
the
gândim
Republic in
o
Romania. And I would like to thank her initiative and support in organizing our conference and also the exhibition. I would like to introduce also His Excellency Mr. Karol, MISTRÍK, Ambassador of the Republic of Slovakia in Romania, and thank him and his colleagues for his dedicated agreement to join us for this important meeting. Also, I would like to introduce Ambassador Stefan TOMAŠEVIĆ, Ambassador of the Republic of Serbia, for his prompt cooperation in realizing this anniversary exhibition. And it's also my great pleasure to introduce Ms. Mihaela Cămărășan, Secretary General of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which will address to all participants a welcome speech for our reunion. But first of all, let me say a few things about. Afterwards, we'll have online several colleagues. I just wanted to introduce those who are present here. But since this is well, a hybrid event with online participation, of course, we'll have the pleasure to have some guests from Prague and also from other capitals. Let me say a few words before well, the distinguished ambassador present here will address you. And I would start by saying that we have decided to organize this event in cooperation with the Czech Republic Embassy in Bucharest to mark the centenary of the Little Entente. And let me remind you, well, a question that Nicolae Titulescu in a manuscript from 1937 asked, what is, he answered, what is, he asked, the Little Entente. And to quote him, the Little Entente was an association of 3 states for mutual protection against common dangers. And I think this was a perfect definition and the major philosophy of this endeavor. It was, in fact, the first collective security alliance, a defensive one, created after the First World War. Why? To oppose revisionist policies against the peace treaties and the territorial status quo. Concluded after the war, the political and military documents underwent successive renewals in 1923, 1926, and 1929, until the signing of the Pact of Organization of the Little Entente in 1933. It was then when the 3 countries decided to create a permanent council, regular meetings of foreign ministers, an economic council, coordination of their foreign policies and economic interests beyond the existing conference of the chiefs of the general staffs of the armies of member states. The 1933 Pact represented an important step in transforming the Little Entente from a cooperation institution into an integrative one. The new Pact of Organization contained a clause whereby none of the 3 members could give any undertaking without the consent of the other 2. The intention was to quote again Nicolae Titulescu, to reinforce the bonds of the Little Entente in such a way that if any of its members should be attacked by one of its members, the latter would become ipso iure the enemy of the Little Entente. A similar philosophy, and I end this quote, a similar philosophy might be found in Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty on collective defense, concluded 16 years later after a new war. I also dare to say that the Little Entente was the first exercise after the Great War to gradually building an institution of political and economic integration. From 1921 to 1933, the process might be compared, keeping proportions, with a transformation which took place later of the European Economic Community into an European Union. We are here, dear friends, not only to review the activities of the Little Entente, but also to honor those who were the founding fathers of the project in Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. You can see them on the photos in the exhibition that we have organized with the support of the Archives Department of the Foreign Ministry and the embassies here represented. This conference is an attempt to learn from the achievements and failures of the Little Entente, what we have to do and can do in our period of new international turbulences. And I end my short introduction by quoting again Nicolae Titulescu, who used to say, when peace is in danger, the answer is not the war, but the organization of peace. And I think this is one of the main reasons why together we decided to organize this event, to remember, to learn, and to act. And now let me invite Ms. Kamareshan to give us to tell us what the Foreign Ministry would like us to do on this occasion.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. President Nың STASE, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests. On behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, thank the host and the initiator of this event, Mr. Adrian Nың STASE, President of Titulescu European Foundation, and to express our appreciation for organizing this international conference dedicated to the Centenary of Defense Alliance between Romania and the Kingdom of Serb, Croats, and Slovenes and Czechoslovakia, known as Little Entente, the first regional security and defense system designed to ensure mutual security in Central Eastern Europe after the Versailles Peace. We all know that history can be, depending on its interpretation, sometimes tricky, beyond being a powerful source of substance. We should learn and be inspired by it, but we should also avoid treating it plainly as a textbook. This is why today's event is important. It allows us to put context to history and see it in its long-term implications. The 1921 regional defense system was founded on two main pillars: the Romanian-Polish Defense Alliance and the defensive alliance between Romania, the Kingdom of Serb, Croats, and Slovenes, and Czechoslovakia, known as the Little Entente, an alliance initiated in 1920 and concluded in 1921. In order to mark this centennial event, the Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of National Defense, with the support of our colleagues from Diplomatic Archives Unit and the Institute for Political Studies of Defense and Military History, published 2 albums dedicated to these alliances. Ladies and gentlemen, also I would like to underline that this year, our Diplomatic Archive Unit put together 2 wonderful exhibitions dedicated to the complex political and diplomatic relations within the 2 defensive alliances. These exhibitions illustrate the role of diplomacy in the creation of the regional defense system created a century ago and the overall dynamics that shape their architecture. In this context, marked by major geopolitical turmoil, national construction or reconstruction, the economic, political, and military development of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe constituted a process that required a high level of adaptation and creativity. Diplomacy also had to adapt. The natural response of the states in this area has been the association and merging of resources by creating a regional system of security arrangements. Fulfilling its role in the regional stage, Romania was a critical vector in building the new regional security and defense geography, a complex project meant to provide defense and the major directions of strategic exposure. In hindsight, we can say that the model represented by the Little Entente contains lessons that remain relevant to this day, a century later. At the time, the 3 countries realized that they could not manage on their own the multiple dangers they face, but they choose to build together a format of cooperation based on a common agenda of security, interest, and objectives. At the same time, they sought to maintain an active engagement to their Western allies, especially France, and to encourage the involvement in the management of great power geopolitical games that put constant pressure on the security of small states in Central and Eastern Europe between the 2 world wars. The idea behind the establishment of Romania's first regional defense system, created in 1921, remains just relevant today, as are the limitations and constraints that mark its unfortunate outcome. History shows that the solutions did not match the overgrowing risks that come from weaponized extremist ideologies. The numerous external and domestic opponents of peace stability lead to the final failure that the integrationist project of the Little Entente. Ladies and gentlemen, the alliance was de facto dissolved with dismemberment of the Czechoslovak state in 1938, and this early apparent failure favored a rather critical and limiting historical geographical vision and approach to this important piece of diplomatic history. These are further supplemented by the complexity of the topic and the extensive documentary needs required for a comprehensive approach of the subject. At the time of geostrategic change, we are again looking at the relative strengths and advantages of a system of security alliances and integrative process in Europe. We consider that the lessons of our diplomatic history should be studied, and we know that history is all the time a source of inspiration. I'm convinced that this conference will contribute to a better understanding of the role of this alliance and to bring new insight within the complex process carried out in the interwar years by our countries in building a regional solution for peace and reconfirm the essential importance of the international rules-based order. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. And now it is my honor to invite Minister Tomaș to give us his views on the subject of our conference. Mr. Minister, you have the floor, even online, but well, the conditions are as they are, and but we are very honored to have you with the speech in our conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, and really thank you for the organization of this very important event and for allowing me to join you online, given the circumstances and the coronavirus restrictions. It really is a great opportunity to join you, even at times when otherwise I wouldn't have been able to. So it's a great honor for me personally, because I have a very to be present with you through this forum, because I have a very cordial relationship to Romania as well as to the other countries of the Little Entente, and I was just crossing during the speech of Ms. Kamarashan, my speech, because it was so well put and so precisely and detailedly explained what Little Entente was about. So what is left from my speech is something I would say punctual, some concrete and tangible examples of what Little Entente was bringing to our countries, and it is crucial, I believe, to bring these little examples, even though they play a major role, to bring these concrete examples when they play the major role in the history of our countries. I will start with saying that in general, Little Entente for us in our historical archives and also at the Ministry of Defense as we conceive it and in our government was not only about the Entente itself. It was not only about the military aspect of the alliance, but it was a forum that allowed us to discuss many more issues, such as the recognition of USSR, the economic crisis, the meltdown in the early 1930s, and also the trade connection between our countries, because at the time Romania and Czechoslovakia were neighboring countries. And there were many other economical and social aspects that this military alliance allowed to take root and therefore to bring our countries closer. I also have to mention another aspect. In the Czech Republic, everybody who is interested in the military history is very well aware of the fact that Czechoslovakia was a #1 world producer and exporter in the mid-1930s of military material. And it was also one of the reasons that Hitler decided to attack Czechoslovakia and to dismantle Czechoslovakia in the very early stages of his expansionist ambitions. And the reason was the industrial basis and the production of military material of the heavy mechanized brigades and divisions he was building. And one of the main reasons Czechoslovakia was so successful in this was the Little Entente. It's not a very well-known fact that through this alliance, our production was basically designed, developed, and produced together with Romania and Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and later Yugoslavia. Because at the time where our export was among either the first in the world or among the top 5 in the world in the 1930s, it was the Little Entente countries who were the recipients of between 25 and 50% of the total volume of the export. And the designs and the ideas behind were coming from the capitals and from the militaries of these countries. So this is a very important aspect. This is a very important layer of the relationship, that it not only was put on paper when it came to potential dangers, but it also brought tangible results in the relationship. Also, I have to say that it's, and this is more of even a more concrete example, not only the whole machine of the military industrial, the material protection of the countries was linked together, but also on the intelligence side, on the foreign political side, Romania and Little Entente played a pivotal role in our resistance, because there is a figure in the Czech history which is well known to anyone who has any interest in it, and the name is Heliodor Píka, General Heliodor Píka. He was a defense attaché in the I'm sorry, I blacked out, I guess. Can you hear me now? Yes, I'm really sorry for the interruption. I was mentioning the name of General Heliodor Píka, who was one of the first victims. Most people know him because he was one of the first victims of the communist regime, executed for his pro-Western stand in 1949. There are many streets in the Czech Republic that are named after him. There are many military units that are named after him, the most recognized ones. And it's a little known fact that his survival for the 10 years, the very fact that he was not executed by the Nazis already, was thanks to Little Entente. It was thanks to his relationship with the Romanian authorities. And it's through his posture as a defense attaché that he deepened and developed new relationships on a strategic level between our countries. And it's through this relationship that he established one of our most successful operational networks during the resistance against the Nazis, called Doru. And it was basically a label for the Balkan route to escape from the occupied Czechoslovakia, and for the operations that were taking place here in Czechoslovakia, as well as in the countries. He was arrested by Nazi authorities after the fascist putsch in Romania in October 1940, and yet, because of the history of our cooperation, on a personal order of the Minister of Interior of Romania, he was released and he was able to move to Turkey and then later to other theaters of operations against the Nazi regime. So this is another thing that he basically spent a good third of his active military career in Romania working on Little Entente, one of the most famous and important figures in our military history. Which only underlines how practically and tangibly important the relationship was. So even though it wasn't so successful in facing the gravest threats that Europe has seen in the 20th century, namely the rise of the Nazi Germany, it was successful not only in bringing the countries closer and to the table and having the same positions, but to make change for people's lives, for individuals' lives, as well as for our military's lives, industrial production, and our whole orientation towards one each other. And I believe it's a great basis also these days to link this famous part of our history to the present. Because we do have these formats where we can discuss it, be it in the EU or in NATO. And it's something that the more we know about, the more we should be bringing the agenda forward to revive some of these most important parts of our history, and to give them a new breath of life. Because the proximity, the not only geographical but also the mental, the societal proximity between our nations is great, and therefore this is why I was so honored to be invited here to give my view on this, because it's not only a matter of history, but I see it, I conceive of it as a route that we might have been cut away from for some time, but that it's ripe for growing again and for looking after the legacy with new ways of putting it in life. So thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Minister. Thank you for sharing with us those very interesting information and your opinions. And let's move on. And I would like to invite Miss Halka KAISEROVA, Ambassador of the Czech Republic in Romania, to give us her opinions about this event. But I want to thank her very much for the initiative, for working with us, for helping us in many ways to organize this conference. So please, Ambassador, you have the floor.
Let me start by expressing my deepest gratitude to Titulescu European Foundation for hosting this conference. We all appreciate that this important event can take place despite the complicated COVID situation that unfortunately prevented the Czech speakers to participate in person. But we had a great interest from the side, which you could definitely hear from the important words of the Deputy Minister Kopečný. I would like to thank you for your hospitality and all the efforts undertaken during the preparations, because I cannot imagine a better venue for a conference to commemorate the anniversary of the Little Entente than in the house of Titulescu European Foundation, bearing the name of a renowned Romanian diplomat and politician who was one of the key figures leading the project that we will commemorate and discuss today. We are aware that it is a 100 years anniversary of signing the bilateral convention between Czechoslovakia and Romania, which significantly contributed to conclusion of a mutual defense arrangement among 3 European states, then Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania, known as Little Entente. The political and security situation after the World War in Europe was highly complicated and unpredictable. Therefore, the governments of the 3 new states decided to forge alliances to protect and help each other and promote stability and prosperity in our region and whole Europe. Eduard Beneš, a key member of Czechoslovak delegation at Paris Peace Conference, who served as the first Minister of Foreign Affairs of Czechoslovakia, and who later on became one of the major architects of Little Entente, wrote in 1922. The European War created the preconditions for a new adjustment of Europe and the substitution of new independent states for Austro-Hungarian states monarchy. This was not only a historic justice, but at the same time, the very interest of Europe generally. In the same document, he explains the mission and interest of Czechoslovakia and the goals of the state was determined to pursue by following words. Czechoslovakia and her leaders have been from the very outset conscious of the fact that it would be their task to convert into positive, creative effort that splendid determination for independent existence displayed so successfully by the whole nation in its work for the revolution, that they would have to consolidate the state within and secure it against dangers from without, that on basis of the peace treaties, they would arrive at just relation with all their neighbors and contribute to the best of their powers and abilities to the pacification and consolidation of Europe, unsettled by long years of warfare. The Little Entente was created with the ambition not only to assure the implementation of the peace conventions and protect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its members. In addition, as it was mentioned by President NÄ STASE, as it was mentioned also by the Deputy Minister, it also served as a platform for political and economic cooperation. It was very much in line with the Czechoslovak foreign policy regarding the Central and Southeastern Europe, which used to be described by a slogan: pacify, reconstruct, and consolidate. I dare to say that some of the priorities and values proclaimed by the political leaders of the first independent and democratic republic on the Czech territory in 1918 are still fundamental and inspiration even for today. The Little Entente did not withstand the test of time. During the next 2 decades, scorched by violent and extremist political movements that led us into cataclysm of the World War II with even more dire consequences than World War I. Nevertheless, it was a remarkable attempt to contribute to shaping then international and security policy in the region that was ever being impacted so profoundly by the major conflicts of the recent history. Václav Havel, the leader of the Velvet Revolution and the first president of our re-established democratic state, was very mindful of the interconnectedness between the developments in the region and on the international stage, where interests of global powers come into play. Therefore, he was such a strong advocate of Euro-Atlantic integration, as well as of an active Czech role in this regard. We can hardly overestimate the benefits the Czechs, Romanians, and other nations have gained from the integration and from the fact we share the same values, opportunities, but at the same time, responsibilities. From the perspective, the Little Entente should be appreciated as a courageous project to promote many of these goals, despite its ultimate failure. Thus, this is very important and timely that historical, geographical, and political contexts and consequences of the Little Entente will be discussed here further and examined from various points of view by so many distinguished experts, historians, and political scientists. Finally, I would like to inform you that Mr. Karel Straka from the Military History Institute in Prague will speak about the Little Entente as a subject of European strategy, is also an author of the exhibition on Little Entente you cannot unfortunately see today, but the link to the exhibition websites will be shared with all the participants after the conference. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot change the history, but we need to learn from it. Let me wish us all production and fruitful discussion. And again, I would like to thank to President NÄSTASE for organizing such important event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think we have to continue to organize this kind of gatherings, this kind of conferences, because on one side, we can learn from history, but we can also organize the peace and the cooperation between us, thinking about next steps, about well, the way we can cooperate today. Now, let me invite Ambassador Karol MISTRÍK, Ambassador of the Slovak Republic in Romania, to give us a speech. Ambassador.
Good morning. Working? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. And let me express my thanks and congratulations to the Titulescu Institute and you personally for hosting this very important event. Let me thank and congratulate my colleague, Czech Ambassador Halka KAISEROVA, for taking the initiative and inspiring this conference can happen. And of course, my Serbian colleague for taking part and supporting this event with the presence and the inputs of historians. My colleague KAISEROVA and Deputy Minister Occasionally just a while ago said many important things, basically key messages about Little Entente. I have to just remind you that Slovakia was constituent part of Czechoslovakia, so history of Czechoslovakia is the history of Slovakia as well. So that means the foreign policy of Czechoslovakia was also the foreign policy of Slovakia because it was integral part of that state. Very important lessons are to be learned from the Little Entente. You already mentioned that that was the first collective defense pact after the First World War. You very correctly quoted the words of Minister Titulescu, who said that Pact was established to face or to counter the common dangers. Nowadays language we would perhaps use defense concerns, but the complexity of relations after the First War was immense. And what is more important about Little Entente is that it maybe originally was projected and developed or established as a defensive pact. Then it turned and developed into also economic cooperation, which was very important. And this effect brought our nations very close. So there were elements of common policy and many more. This span of this 20 years of existence are again learning us or teaching us that history is not just an inspiration. History is primarily about the facts, and we have to really learn from the development, and especially the later part of the existence of Entente. And there was already mentioned the breakup of Czechoslovakia, 38, and the Munich Treaty. These circumstances must not be forgotten. They are well studied, and the lectures and lections should be drawn upon. I'm very happy that Slovakia can join the conference through participation of our historian from Slovak Academy of Science, which will be delivered later on. Mr. President, summing up, let me thank you once again for facilitating this event, and I wish everybody and this conference every success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Let me remind a very interesting conference that Nicolae Titulescu presented at the University of Bratislava when he became Doctor Honoris Causa of the university. And he referred quite extensively to the Little Entente and the cooperation between the three countries. I think it is something that we can learn also from those strategies. Sometimes seemed a little bit utopian, but nevertheless they were intended to consolidate an old relationship, and it proved later on, especially in '68, that those kind of roots were very precious in organizing a very concrete relationship in a time of difficulty. Now, allow me to give the floor to Ambassador Stefan TOMAŠEVIĆ, Ambassador of the Republic of Serbia in Romania. Please.
First of all, before I start, I would like to underline how much this event is important personally for me, keeping in mind the fact that I served before Romania in Czech Republic. Dear President of Foundation, Mr. NÄSTASE, Your Excellencies, respectful representatives of institutions and professors, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants. Let me first express how glad and honored I am to be here today due to the fact that all of us, representatives of countries that used to form Little Entente, participate together in such an important conference that will mark the centenary of the alliance in the best possible way. We appreciate and congratulate on all efforts invested in the organization of this event. Even though the main and urgent aim of the Little Entente as a military alliance created in 1920 and 1921 by Czechoslovakia, Romania, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes was a joint defense against revanchism, the real purpose of the Little Entente had a much broader context, because it was meant to prevent any violation of the independence of its states that could be committed by any power. Let me remind you that the Kingdom of Serbia gave an unprecedented contribution to the freedom of Europe in the First World War. We lost more than 1,200,000 inhabitants, which was 30% of our population at the time and 60% of our male population. In addition to major human casualties, Serbia's economy and infrastructure have been significantly destroyed. Having said that, there is no doubt that durable stability and security on the regional level was in the interest of Little Entente countries, which was the first alliance in this area following the Great War. During the time, this alliance became more than a simple defense alliance. it included strategical, political, and economical elements as well. Subsequent inclusion of the Economic Council in the organizational structure of the Little Entente shows that the member states expressed their will to harmonize economic interests. Through cooperation with mutual respect and respect for the freedom and independence of all states, and sharing common values and visions, our countries have achieved what would be unattainable for each of them individually. Doesn't this remind us a lot of today? Wasn't this the forerunner of what we have today and what we strive for? Unfortunately, the Little Entente, as well as all the rest, was increasingly threatened by the rise of fascism in Europe. Not to mention here all bad and unfortunate things that followed. Let me just remind you that fascist and terrorist movements brought to the assassination of Yugoslav King Alexander I and French Foreign Minister Louis Berthoud in 1934, who were among the leading supporters of the Little Entente. All this, along with other geopolitical reasons of the time, led to the disintegration of the alliance and to the introduction of the Second World War. What existed 100 years ago in the background of the creation of Little Entente still exists today. The need for states to unite in alliances and organizations within which they jointly and more strongly protect their rightful and justified interests existed then and still exists today. Even more, current global threats and challenges know no borders, and they exceed the capabilities and capacities of one country and even one region or continent. Now, more than ever, we need to talk, exchange our thoughts and ideas, cooperate and help each other, finding an adequate common responses to all threats in order to ensure peace and security and well-being of our citizens. The Republic of Serbia is firmly determined to respond to all the challenges of modern times, be it terrorism, organized crime, cyber and hybrid threats, proliferation of weapons, illegal migration, human trafficking, or those challenges resulting from armed conflicts and crises, climate change, poverty, water and food shortages, or pandemics. In this regard, Serbia is responsibly developing cooperation at all levels, regionally and globally, with all friends and partners, but having in mind that our strategic priority is cooperation with the EU and the full membership of the Republic of Serbia in the EU. The European Union has been created as a major peace project that represents a model of the highest level of integration achieved in modern political history. It has enabled reconciliation of European nations and countries of different political, security, and cultural heritage. Nowadays, all our former allies in the Little Entente are EU member states, and Serbia is a candidate country negotiating its accession to the EU. Serbia has always been a part of the European family. It is naturally oriented, strategically committed to the cooperation with the EU member states and its institutions. We respect and share values that the EU is based upon. For many years now, Serbia has been making a significant contribution by its participation in EU crisis management operations. Serbia is a part of the EU battle groups as well, and is one of only 4 non-EU countries that have signed administrative arrangements with the European Defense Agency. Our national security strategy and defense strategy are in line with the EU global strategy. All these are indicators of our strong commitment to be a reliable and responsible partner that contributes and shares the burden as a friend and equal partner. Migration crisis and health crisis, as is current COVID-19 pandemic, has specifically shown us the extent to which mutual cooperation and solidarity approach is necessary, and Serbia has proved that it is ready to take on its share of obligations and provide its contribution. Another link that connects us with our former Little Entente allies in the context of nowadays alliances is cooperation within and with NATO. As everyone knows, the Republic of Serbia pursues a policy of military neutrality which means that we have no aspirations to become part of NATO or any other military alliance. However, our military neutrality is not an obstacle to partnership cooperation. During the past 15 years in NATO's Partnership for Peace program, Serbia has achieved significant cooperation with NATO member states and partner countries. Through the individual partnership action plan, Serbia has achieved the highest level of cooperation that a non-member can have with the alliance. The Republic of Serbia and NATO are also firmly connected by a common interest in preserving peace and stability in the Western Balkans region. NATO is an indispensable factor of regional stability due to the fact that KFOR troops are responsible for the security on Kosovo and Metohija, and I use this opportunity to thank you for your country's contributions to this mission. Unfortunately, we cannot talk about NATO without mentioning that relations are still burdened by the difficult legacy of the 1999 bombing. Therefore, we very much appreciate gestures as well as the gesture of NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, who expressed regret over the civilian victims of the bombing, or the one made by Czech President Zeman, which are seen as an important steps in the direction of healing the wounds. I would like to complete this short overview of nowadays main alliances and organizations with the emphasizing importance of the United Nations. The goals and principles of the United Nations should be of the extreme importance for all of us. Equal rights of large and small nations, maintaining international peace and security, and resolving disputes by peaceful means in accordance with the principles of justice and international law. Referring from threats and use of force which would be directed against the territorial integrity or political independency of states. We are very grateful to all countries that share the same position regarding the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Republic of Serbia, not recognizing unilaterally declared independence of so-called Kosovo, and we are proud that we find this kind of support among our Little Entente allies as well. Serbia firmly believes in the principles of humane solidarity and cooperation, and in that sense has always advocated the establishment and development of partnership and friendly relations with all countries in the region, Europe and the world. Serbia is proud of its participation in the Little Entente and is proud of the relations it has built with its participating states during the history. These are our friendly countries with which we have an excellent cooperation, both bilaterally and multilaterally. It still remains as a goal for all of us to develop our future cooperation within the EU once Serbia becomes one of its member states. We hope this goal will be achieved in our near future and that we will continue to receive strong support of our Little Entente allies in this regard. I wish successful conference to all participants, and once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your comments and the updates. And now let's turn online. I would like to invite Nemanja Starović, State Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Serbia, to introduce us a very interesting topic, current relevance of the ideas of the Little Entente on the necessity of cooperation, respect for the international legal order, and the prevention of historical revisionism. Well, you have the floor, please.
Dear colleagues and distinguished guests, I'm greatly pleased and honored to have the opportunity to address you on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Serbia at this event marking the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Little Entente. The treaty on the establishment of the Little Entente was, above all, an expression of efforts being made in the wake of the greatest armed conflict in the history of humankind thus far, to create a mechanism that would be a barrier to the resumption of conflicts and guarantee lasting peace in Europe. It is important to point out that the members of the Little Entente, although determined to defend their interests, did not at any time try to impose their political and economic hegemony on others, but instead acted with the aim of strengthening the prosperity of all European countries. That this was indeed the case was demonstrated, for instance, through participation in the founding and continuous contribution to the work of the League of Nations, support to the 1922 Protocol for the Economic and Financial Reconstruction of Austria in the framework of the League of Nations, support to the economic renewal of Hungary and its joining the League of Nations, on condition that it would adhere to the agreements made and international commitments, and in particular through the clearly stated position that the idea of the French minister Aristide Briand about the need for a federal link between European countries in the future, presented at the session of the Assembly of the League of Nations of September the 5th, 1929 in Geneva, was fully in line with the policy goals of the Little Entente. Although it was formed primarily as a defense alliance, its successes were not achieved on the battlefield, but instead, in the first years of its existence, it developed the profile of a deterrent factor against conflicts and a power that supported the order established after the First World War. Its first concrete result was thwarting the attempt of Karol I to reclaim the Hungarian throne and restore the rule of the Habsburg monarchy in 1921. At that moment, no one could have guessed that 20 years later the war and conflicts would unfortunately already resume with an even greater intensity, and that Europe and the world would face far more terrible destruction. The indecisiveness of the great powers in the face of growing fascism and Nazism, which, in addition to the ideology of national or racial superiority, were based on revanchist tendencies, led to the creation of an environment in which the Little Entente could no longer effectively oppose the aggression of Nazi Germany. One of the key elements in this course of events was the assassination of the Yugoslav king Alexander I Karađorđević and the French Minister of Foreign Affairs Louis Bartoc in Marseille on October the 9th, 1934. King Alexander and Louis Bartoc were the promoters of policy on which the Little Entente rested, and they fell as victims of political terrorism inspired and organized by the fascist movement. In the years after this tragic event, the support of France and its active engagement declined, which culminated in the dissolution of the Little Entente and the adoption of the Munich Agreement, which permitted the German annexation of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. In those years, the Yugoslav government, faced with dramatic changes on the European scene, made a transition to a policy of pragmatism and rapprochement with Germany and Italy, unsuccessfully attempting to save the country from new destruction and disintegration. It turned out, however, and this is more than clear from the historical distance, that any attempt to compromise with fascism and revisionism is destined to fail and can only be a short break, during which such tendencies continue to strengthen and which further inevitably leads to new destruction. Retreating in the face of aggressive policies that are solely based on force and opposed to the international order and principles only goes to further whet the appetites which sooner or later unavoidably result in renewed aggression and new conflicts and instability. Today, the world is more complex. Relations between states are more complicated, and the level of their interdependence is far higher than at the time of the emergence of the Little Entente. Although today's circumstances are different, the legacy of the Little Entente is still relevant through the values on which it was based: commitment to democracy, resistance to militarization and historical revisionism, respect for equality and integrity of all actors at the international level, and efforts to preserve peace and stability in Europe. Guided by these very principles, the Republic of Serbia is unambiguously committed to strengthening cooperation with all countries in the region, and I'm particularly pleased to note that our relations today are at an exceptionally high level, not only with countries that were members of this alliance, but also with those that were on the opposite side during the First World War. European integration is a strategic commitment of our country because we see it as a mechanism that not only contributes to economic integration and progress, but at the same time represents the best guarantee of peace and cooperation on our continent. Furthermore, at the global level, our firm commitment to strengthening multilateralism, respecting international law, and the role of the United Nations are part of a pledge to preserve the global order that emerged after the Second World War and a barrier to tendencies that could sway the world in the direction it took in the period between the two world wars. Our efforts to preserve our territorial integrity should also be seen in this context, with full respect for the integrity of other states, because only an order based on the force of the law and not on the law of force can be said to be just and therefore durable and stable. that the spirit of alliance from the time of the Little Entente and the efforts to ensure that international relations are carried out with a full respect for international legal norms are still present in evidence by the fact that neither Romania nor the Slovak Republic recognized the unilaterally declared independence of the so-called Kosovo, and that the President of the Czech Republic, Miloš Zeman, in May this year issued a public apology to the Serbian people for the 1999 NATO aggression. I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate my gratitude for such a consistent and principled positioning and to emphasize that the Republic of Serbia will remain fully committed to building friendly relations and cooperation with our historical allies from the time of the Little Entente. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister. I think now we should invite Dr. Doru LICIU, Director of the Diplomatic Archives at the Foreign Ministry, to present, to explain the exhibition organized on this occasion. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I would like to, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the organizer of this very interesting and very thoughtful international conference, Mr. Adrian NÄSTASE, the president of the European Foundation Titulescu, a foundation who bears the name of our famous ancestor, and which as well carry on his diplomatic legacy. And I would like to say that I'm very grateful for being here with just a glimpse of our exhibition organized this year together with our colleagues from the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, from the Diplomatic Archives Department. And I would like to say you that as a keeper of the institutional memory of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it is our pleasure and our honor to offer to the general public as well to the researchers those very valuable treasures from our archives. As you may see, we have a variety of historical documents, such treaties, political reports from the Romanian embassies and consular offices from abroad, but as well very beautiful pictures and also newspapers from that time. And we are also having just a few, but very significant images filmed at that time. And after this, you will have the chance of seeing a little movie realized by the press department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with the occasion of the Little Entente meeting in Bucharest in May 1925. Even is a silent movie, you still will have the chance to enjoy those images filmed almost 100 years ago. This, as I said, this exhibition was the fruitful result of cooperation with our Czech colleagues, but as well we were able to publish two very attractive, very interesting volumes of documents dedicated to the Romanian-Polish alliance and to the Little Entente, which were published this year with the help of the Institute for Political and Defense Studies from the Ministry of, within the Ministry of National Defense. And as well, this is the fruit of the cooperation, of the great cooperation we have with various institutes from Romania and from abroad. And my colleague is telling me that we received some in the last minute some pictures from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Serbia, and I'm thanking the ambassador for that. That being said, I invite you to take a look at this wonderful exhibition hosted in this amazing room of Titulescu's residence, and I invite you as well to follow our Facebook page, which is called, I would say in Romanian, Arhivele Diplomatice ale Ministerului Afacerilor Externe, and I think in this way we could contribute to the better knowledge of the history of Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but as well at the history of the countries partners in our relations. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. LICIU. Fantastic exhibition, very interesting, and also the volumes, which are quite impressive. Well, I hope that some of you, if not all of you, might get access to those volumes. Some of them can be you can get them from Mr. LICIU or from the military printing house. I think now we can move to the next topic. In fact, the launch ceremony of a Philatelic Occasionally cover, dedicated to the anniversary conference, and I invite Mr. Bartoc from the Cultural Foundation, Bartoc Cultural Foundation, to introduce this topic and to explain what it's all about. Please.
It's a special cover and special cancellation for this event. And I think it's very good for remember for many, many years what happened today here in this conference. And now I want to right here our signature first Czechia here in this space. This is Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. Here must sign your sign, okay? And after that, Slovakia, Serbia, and Romania.
There are 12 envelopes, and well, we are invited to sign those 12 envelopes on behalf of the Czech, Slovak, Serbian, and Romanian partners. But you have to sign 12 times. Well, meanwhile, exactly. Meanwhile, I suggest that we can follow some of the images. Well, the film which was mentioned by Dr. LICIU, and immediately afterwards, we'll have a coffee break. Those who are online will be able to follow those images, and we'll be back at 12:10. So to resume the conference. It's a good opportunity to add a few things because Mr. Bartoc asked us to do the signing of those envelopes. Tache Ionescu was a very special special politician and very interesting, in a way, diplomat. His idea about an alliance included at that time also Greece. In fact, it was a configuration of 5 countries, not only 3. But in the end, for various reasons, only Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia signed the pact. And it's very interesting that even if we call it an institution at that time, at the beginning of 20s, this was only an organization, a legal organization, a juridical organization, because there were 3 treaties with almost the same content. And only afterwards, this legal arrangement, turned into an institution. And finally in 1933, but then the European context changed a lot, and we discussed about common dangers, but the perception about dangers for those 3 countries changed a lot in a very tough environment, and that's why in the end, in 1938, practically, the Little Entente was dissolved. I suggest that we start the coffee break, not to lose time. We invite you to have the coffee downstairs. And we'll turn back in about 15 minutes. This is an announcement also for our colleagues who are joining us online. Okay? Thank you.
ca la măritărită.
Stefan, mulțumite să închizi sau închide de la ușa. Okay, I think we can resume. And I would like to ask Dr. Stefan Titulescu to give us a speech on Romania and the Little Entente for a possible summit. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. More than 100 years ago, the end of the World War I and the peace treaties that fundamentally transformed the world territorial and political configuration were far from bringing the peace and stability so necessary for national and regional reconstruction in Central and Eastern Europe. The state of the region, reborn from the rise of the former imperial powers that had previously dominated, faced, along with enormous task of national construction and reconstruction, a difficult, fluid, and unpredictable security environment marked by major risks. The solution of the countries of the area of this real political, geopolitical, and geostrategic dilemma were limited as a reorientation in the political and military position of the great powers of the Entente was evident, since they were also faced with the great security challenges generated by the reconstruction effort of the international post-war order. The creation of the Little Entente was, in this context, the response of the Central European states to the challenges of the regional security environment. It was also conceived as a tool to amplify the position of the member state in the field of international relations and to strengthen it, the founding international treaties and the institution created for its management. It was, in fact, a logical continuation of a need felt by the small and medium-sized successor states since the first day of the Paris Peace Conference, when, faced with the system imposed by the great powers in negotiating peace treaties, the Romanian Prime Minister Ion Brătianu had the initiative to create a common front to represent and defend the interests of those countries. Faced from the outset with multiple challenges and threats, the Little Entente proved to be a useful tool in promoting and assuring the security interests and needs of its member states. In the Central Eastern European European geopolitical and geostrategic context. His contribution to securing and stabilizing the system of international relations is major, as evidenced not only by the interest and support of the European allied powers, France, Great Britain, but also by the hostility of the revisionist states. Beyond this horizon of analysis, one of the Little Entente most important legacies, all the more visible from the point of view of our current posterity, is the integrative experience it received with the signing of the 1933 Pact of Organization. The community and complementarity of the interests, the similar needs for economical, political, and administrative development, the similar problems the member states were facing not only in the political and military areas, but also in the cultural, economic, and social spheres, altogether have led to the onset and evolution of an unique and complex project of super-state construction that precedes the creation of the community and subsequently of the European Union in the years following the World War II. And all this within the European zone in the second half of the interwar period in a difficult political, economic, and military context marked by the rise of the totalitarianism and the resurgence of the revisionism and nationalism. We can say that with their courage and determination, the political minds of the interwar years who conceived and implemented the project of the Little Entente proved to be much ahead of their times and founded in a credible manner the connection of their state to the European community of values in its modern meaning. Their names, whatever they may be, Tache Ionescu, Nicolae Titulescu, Eduard Beneș, TOMAŠEVIĆ, Nicola Pasic, or Bogovil Jeftic, shall remain not only in the history of international relations, but shall also be decidedly etched in the gallery of the European construct for honors. For Romania, the project of the Little Entente was a vital one in the geopolitical and geostrategic context of the end of the World War I. Faced with major security risks in 3 of the 4 geostrategic theaters of operations, Romania was one of the promoters of the regional cooperation. In this difficult political and military context, in 1921, a defensive alliance agreement was concluded with Poland, as well as similar convention with Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. This endeavor also marked the failure of the Romanian project of an alliance of 5, which Tache Ionescu had promoted in the 1920s, 1921. By joining Poland and Greece to the 3 states of the Little Entente, the Romanian project designed the foundation of an alternative coalition of powers in Central Europe and was able to respond to security challenges and threats already present in the geopolitical reality that marked the end of the World War I. Its fulfillment came in stages and through separate agreements with the signing of the bilateral alliance agreement with Poland in 1921 and the creation of the Balkan Entente in 1934. All those security arrangements based on the structure and the founding principle of the League of Nations have been important contribution made by the Central and Eastern European states to the regional and general European security and to the consolidation and development of the system of international relations in its configuration resulting from the decision of 1918-1920 Paris Peace Conference. For Romania, the Little Entente was therefore a key component of the national project in terms of ensuring national security. Furthermore, it was one of the drives that allowed it to promote and defend its national interests along with other member states in a fluid European concept, not at all favorable to the small and medium-sized states in Central and Eastern Europe. With 1929-1933, the Great Depression, and as the collaboration and coordination of the foreign and security political action of the Little Entente states, the community of interest and economic and its social complementarity give rise to the idea of the next step in the evolution of Little Entente, its transformation into a supranational organization with all the required coordination and integration mechanisms. As I already mentioned, this was happening in a Europe dominated by the resurgence of the nationalism and totalitarian ideologies, in which the very great guarantor powers of the international scene in its post-war configuration had carried out extensive reconsideration and restructurings of their foreign affairs and security policy. Placing at the center of its foreign policy of the defense of the international order and the system implemented by Paris Peace Treaties of the integrity, sovereignty, and national independence of European states, Romania's foreign policy goes through a golden age during the late 1940s. Through the voice of the famous Nicolae Titulescu, Vice President of the League of Nations during the interwar years, Romania and the Little Entente reached the apex of their presence and influence on the international stage. It is the time when the integrative process, as well as the process of coordination and cooperation within the structures of the Little Entente, is at its maximum, but also with other states that are the maximum of their influence and development. Unfortunately, this also marked the beginning of the Little Entente decline and the deep and irreversible deterioration of the interwar order under the combined action of the totalitarian and revisionist state, and in the context of obvious disengagement and conciliation from the Anglo-French allies, which had taken from the very beginning the role of the guarantors of the Covenant of the League of the Nations. The decline and de facto dissolution of the Little Entente occurred under these conditions suddenly and brutally in the fall of 1938, when the Czechoslovak state was sacrificed in the name of ensuring peace. For Czechoslovakia's allies within the Little Entente, the dissolution process, the Czechoslovak state was pushed through by with the agreement of his allies, Occidental allies, was a major blow to their own national security strategies and efforts to defend and promote their national interests, independence, and territorial integrity. It was the beginning of the end and the starting point in the road that would lead a year later to the outbreak of the World War II. A review of the Romanian experience within the small Entente yields a positive result, and we believe one shared by its allies within this regional security structure. The positive nature of the experience and its viability are attested by the subsequent attempts to restore the organization both in time of war for the Little Entente and during the post-war years for the Balkan Entente. The Little Entente remains through its legacy an example of action and determination in favor of European stability and security, not through exclusion and intimidation, but through collaboration, integration, common values, and objectives. This is, in our opinion, the true legacy of the Little Entente and the connection between the people who imagined it and created at the time and their contemporary counterparts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pavlescu. Now let's turn again online. And I invite Dr. Karol Straka from the Military History Institute in Prague to introduce the subject, the Little Entente, subject of European strategy in opinions and considerations of French military strategists in the 30s. Please, Dr. Straka, we are listening to you. If we can have the connection. Not yet. No. It's not functioning. Okay, in that case, let's move to the next speaker, Dr. Mattei Hanola from the Institute of History of Slovak Academy of Science, who is a subject, the place of Little Entente in political concepts and the international plans of Milan Hoxha. And then eventually we can go back to Mr. Straka. Mr. Hanola, please.
So thank you very much for the invitation to this wonderful conference today. So dear Your Excellencies, ambassadors,
No, we can't listen. No, the hackers, the Russians or the Chinese. They are preventing us to listen.
Mr. Hanola, we cannot hear you. Maybe you could close your camera and then speak with your camera closed because it worked afterward.
He's very enthusiastic, but okay, perhaps we should move to Mr. Dietrich, who, well, I can see him. So he has another interesting subject, smaller states and alliance politics in today's world. He's from the Institute of International Relations in Prague. So I suggest that we listen to Dr. Andrei Dietrich.
Hello, good morning from Prague to Bucharest and elsewhere. I do apologize for being slightly late
Is it okay now?
To this panel. Yes, can you hear me and see me?
Later we changed a little bit the program because of the technical difficulties. And we are listening now to Mr. Dietrich, and then we go back to Mr. Hanola and to Mr. Strak afterwards. So if you don't mind, let's continue with Mr. Dietrich, and then we'll come back to you. Please, Mr. Dietrich, please continue.
Okay, thank you so much. So again, I apologize for the slight disturbance, and I hope it will not impact on the program. My subject today that I wish to cover first in introductory remarks, and then I will be happy to follow up in the discussion, is the alliance politics in today's world from the perspective of small or smaller states. I start from the assumption that the resurgence of geopolitics is perhaps not the only defining feature of global politics today, but it is certainly a very important one, and that brings more attention to the issue of security strategies of states within this paradigm. And smaller states have a range of available security strategies that they can pursue. Usually these are divided in two categories. One is the non-alignment strategies, neutrality, hiding, distancing, or porcupine strategy, making prohibitive the costs of foreign occupation. And then there are, of course, cooperative strategies. And here alliances come to play the role as the fundamental means of exercise of the external balancing strategy. But this is not the only cooperative strategy there is also bandwagoning, opportunistically seeking profit by accepting subordinate role to the dominant power, admonishing, compelling major power to counterbalancing, projecting own interest is also known in literature as penetration. And there are others. But we live not in the world of theory, but in the practical world, the real world, which is much more complex, of course, than the theories sometimes assume. So in practice, we have combinations and alloys, dynamic unreeling of state security policy. And we see these ideal types of strategies combine, and this can be, in long, short term. There can be incoherences resulting from unresolved controversies in the security apparatuses of the states. But there can also be kind of willful eclecticism, willful combinations, simultaneous. And I would give an example, the case of the Baltic countries, which of course are NATO members, and one and perhaps key security strategy that they pursue is external balancing against the threat that they perceive. But there is also an element of this porcupine strategy involved, raising the cost of the prospective foreign intervention for the aggressor. Or there is Poland, which also pursues this external balancing strategy through NATO membership, but which also adds to it a fairly strong element of internal balancing, of developing capacities that not necessarily can be used for NATO's collective defense, but can be used for the national defense. And then there is also, and I'd like to come back to this point a little later, hedging as a cooperative strategy, possible where communities of states are in place with overlapping or layered regional security mechanisms. And hedging, historically in literature, has been defined in various ways as kind of keeping options open, like doing really nothing really, or almost in a direct contradiction as pursuing multiple policy options, kind of promiscuous cooperation for influence that is almost ever present. And when I mention hedging, I have something slightly different in mind. It's more about combining or rebalancing investment in several cooperative strategies in the conditions of uncertainty concerning their individual effectiveness and durability. And we've seen this in play in a shift of some sort of smaller states, the Czech Republic included, I believe, with more support in recent years for defense cooperation and operational engagement in CSDP, generally in the European Union security policy, for example, but not at the cost of reducing the importance of NATO. And I think we are likely to see more of this as a result of a deteriorating security environment, but also a degree of lasting anxiety regarding the transatlantic alliance. Of course, there was the Trump card and kind of discourse statements about delinquency, failing to pay enough for the security guarantee, which was a new and for the European allies fairly unpleasant way of framing the lasting issue of burden sharing in the alliance. But I do not believe that this anxiety was resolved with the Biden administration. It points, I believe, to a more lasting problem. What we have seen with the Biden administration is not always too successful alliance management, if you will, though I would argue that there is some kind of learning curve. We've seen, issues, controversies regarding the leaving of pulling out of Afghanistan, AUKUS, now anxiety regarding sort of the fears of some kind of new concert condominium discussions about us and without us in Central Europe regarding kind of addressing Russia's concern about NATO's role in Ukraine, but also in Eastern Europe as such. Now, these are certainly nothing new. There is a book which was written almost 20 years ago by the Norwegian historian Geir Lundestad about empire by invitation, where Lundestad talks about sort of the anxieties in the Western Alliance during the Cold War and the swinging pendulum of these anxieties between the fear of abandonment of West European allies by the United States and striking some kind of great power deal with the Soviet Union and establishing kind of joint condominium over the region. But now, of course, it's immediately related to Ukraine and what has been reported as Biden's diplomatic concessions just days after the Riga summit, where apparently not much of this was discussed beyond raising the stakes potential costs of Russia aggression in Ukraine. And now we are learning about a plan for these high-level meetings to discuss Russia's concern about NATO. And in some way, I would argue that this is a good thing because the situation in the region is quite unstable with rising tensions. There were deployments including hypersonics and other escalatory weapon systems and very limited arms control mechanisms in place. But it's only a good thing up to a point as long as, it concerns strategic empathy rather than appeasement as a guiding principle. And we're not talking about concessions related to NATO member states and allies. Security does not suffer, even in the long term. But back to the beginning, I would be happy to expand on that, but I don't want to take too much time now in the beginning. So back to the beginning and concluding, also for smaller states, alliances, especially peacetime alliances, remain one of the most effective ways to achieve security on one hand, but they are always also precarious because of asymmetries, because of narrower or broader sets of interest between allies, and also great power unilateral instincts. There is some solid research that was done in the US foreign and security policy community, from which it emerged that however inconvenient it may sound to us as allies, for US policymakers, treaty allies and their positions do not always matter as much as we would like. This is not to say that allies and their views do not matter, but only to a point, and their interests and preferences can be sacrificed from time to time. Now, what can smaller states do to reduce the related risks? And here I would make three points. One is to exercise strategic empathy, not only toward our rivals and opponents, but also our allies, to avoid too narrow readings of the alliance politics, to recognize the multiple chessboard and sometimes the sets of Go or even combinations of both, and very practically also the entrapment risks that the great powers may feel, right? Not to fall for kind of intellectual complacency and factoring in the dynamic nature of securing the environment and of alliances. Alliances are not immortal. They need maintenance efforts. The second point concerns the hedging strategy, which I mentioned and which I believe is reasonable where available, ideally in the case of NATO and the European Union member states and their overlapping membership within the single set of forces paradigm. And strategic autonomy conceived not as separation or hiding on a grand scale, waiting out the US-China competition, but seen more as responsibility for own security and defense. And the third point is about squaring one key problem of alliances as fundamentally means of external balancing. And this problem is that when, and this is not the case of all alliances, not even all US alliances, and there are some 115 countries in the world that have some type of alliance agreement with the United States. But when, as with NATO, certainly, allies are being assured of external security guarantees, there is solid empirical research that demonstrates that they have powerful incentives to reduce their military spending, and often do so. After all, it's called external balancing, right? But this is, of course, the problem for the major power in the alliance, in the case of NATO, for the United States. And burden sharing issue was an issue or has been an issue ever since NATO was established as a real defense organization after the Korea War, not as a Washington Treaty, but as a real defense organization. But this, I would argue, is not a problem just for the major power in the alliance, in this case, the United States, but ultimately it's a problem for everyone. Because yielding to these domestic pressures to redirect resources to other domains and sort of free ride on security is a very imprudent policy in the long term, not least because it actually increases the risks of abandonment by the major power, by the United States in this case, of which the smaller states are ironically often anxious about. I would end here. Thank you for your attention, and I would be very happy to discuss any of this further on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Dear
Dietrich.
Excellencies, I'm already ready again, so
just a moment.
just let you know.
Just a moment. Well, I wanted to emphasize the very interesting points which were made by Dr. Dietrich, and perhaps we should have another meeting discussing the security concepts and threat perception, because the problem of the threat perception of the major actor in an alliance is extremely important. And if you go back to the Little Entente, you can see that in the 20s, at the beginning, the three countries had a common perception of the threat. It was the revisionist attitude, especially of Hungary at that time. Later on in the 30s, well, Yugoslavia had a different perception in order to survive, to have its own interests protected, had an interesting treaty of with Italy and then with Bulgaria. Well, Czechoslovakia also at that time hoped in a different approach, being very sensitive to the relations with Soviet Union. And so at that moment, the perception of threat of the three countries, including Romania, were different. And that's why, well, the Little Entente as an alliance was dismantled, because they didn't have at that moment, and I'm referring to the second part of the 30s, well, common objectives, common approach, common definition of the foreign threat. And that's why what you were telling now about, well, the small countries, small powers, big powers, Ukraine, whatever the situation, is very interesting, because you can learn from the past and understand which are the weak points of some of the alliances we are in now. That's why I think it was a very interesting contribution. And we have to lean, we can go from well, the lessons of the past to nowadays thinking about the interests of our countries in a new environment. So once again, thank you very much, Dr. Dietrich. And now let's go back to Mr. Mattei Hanola, if he can hear us. And,
yes, I do.
Okay, very good. And now we are also listening to you.
So I apologize sincerely for the falling out of the line. I guess the computer is a little bit older, so I will not be switching between my windows anymore. So for my paper, I have chosen Milan Hoxha, the well-known figure of Slovak politics of the first half of the 20th century. He was probably the most influential politician of this period in Slovakia. We know him as a permanent member of the parliament, of the Czechoslovak parliament in the interwar period. And also he was a member of several governments during this time. His political career peaked from November 35 till September 38, when he was as the first Slovak of the Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia. What is important about his contribution to Little Entente is that Hoxha was maybe the only Slovak politician of this period who was thinking about problems of Slovakia, Czechoslovakia, and Central Europe in broader perspective. So he was also dealing with international affairs, and he was coming with his own foreign policy concepts. And one of these concepts is his well-known concept of federation in Central Europe, which he then developed during the exile, during the World War II. But already during the interwar period, he was stressing the need of cooperation of the so-called Central European countries. What he meant was that by Central Europe, we have to stress that his Central Europe was a very broad region, bordering from the Baltic in the north to the Adriatic and the Black Sea in the south. So it was a broad region between, we can say, Germany and Russia, which was for a long time the buffer zone between those great powers. So he stressed even during the interwar period that these countries are left for cooperation. They need to cooperate not only politically but also economically to form a firm bloc which would be able, after the World War I, we know that the status of Germany, and Russia, their own problems, they were not powers anymore, but he knew that this will not last forever. So these countries have only one thing, which can save them. So they need to cooperate to build a firm bloc and resist those powers. So he already during the 20s saw the Little Entente, which he welcomed the establishment of Little Entente. He welcomed. He saw the role of Little Entente very broadly, not just the military alliance, but also a political cooperation and economic cooperation was needed. And also he had this plan to enlarge the cooperation between Little Entente also to other countries. So during the 20s, he was thinking mostly about Poland, who could join, because the interests of Poland were largely the same as the Little Entente countries, to keep the Versailles system alive, and also, and later maybe Bulgaria and other countries would join in. So then he also criticized sometimes the Little Entente for diplomatic formalism, especially at the end of the 20s, and for the lack of cooperation. Especially, he always stressed that what is the basis for any unit of states to function is the economic cooperation, which is the basis. So he was sometimes very critical that the economic cooperation between Little Entente countries was not in not in the state that was needed. So then in the 30s, and especially in 35, when he became the prime minister, and for several weeks he was also the caretaker at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So he came with his plan for Central Europe, which is known as a Hoxha's plan, and he tried to make it real. So the plan was based on the idea that Little Entente should become the core of this integration of Central Europe, of Hoxha's Central, and later would spread to another countries. His goal was to establish a functional and economic cooperation between Little Entente countries. This was the first thing. So the task for Czechoslovakia, he saw to offer preferential tariffs to Romania and Yugoslavia. Once again, the economic cooperation was the most important thing for the other aspects of the cooperation. The next step to him was to broaden this cooperation with Rome Protocol countries, namely Austria and Hungary, and after their approval to continue with the integration of Balkan Entente countries and possibly later with Baltic countries also. Hoxha selected in this period Austria as the first country to join Little Entente, and it was for several reasons. Vienna was during this period more willing to cooperate with Little Entente because it was coming, as we know, under intense pressure from Nazi Germany. Winning over the Alpine Republic for cooperation for him was also viewed as a potential tool to avoid the restoration of Habsburgs in Austria, which some circles in Austria saw as a protection against Nazis. After concluding the trade agreement between Prague and Vienna, which was the first step he planned, Czechoslovak allies, so Romania and Yugoslavia, would follow. He also was in his plan having this idea that Western powers would then be persuaded to open their market for the Central European agricultural products, their oversupplies, which according to Hoxha was a step that would also benefit the interests of Britain and France, because by the strengthening of the Central European economies, they would be able to sell more of their industrial products in this region. And then the plan was, the core of the plan was that the common economic interests would also be the factor that, according to Hoxha, had the potential to persuade Hungary, which was, of course, in the beginning of the 20s, the enemy of the Little Entente, we can say in parentheses. So Hungary will have no choice, but because of its economic interest, also to join him. At the beginning of 1936, Hoxha also undertook several visits to Paris and Belgrade and held conferences with his Austrian counterpart Schuschnigg about this so-called plan. But however, as we know, Hoxha's plan was born during a very hostile time for the development of Central European cooperation. The first blow came already at the beginning of March 1936, when German military entered Rhineland, which was directly a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. During the February, even before, Hungary announced that its government had no interest in any political agreement with Czechoslovakia, so they were still holding their revisionist line, despite of the possible economic benefits of the plan. And the effort to win over Austria ended finally in July 1936, when Vienna was forced to sign, we can say, a new treaty with Berlin, which made Austria responsible to coordinate foreign policy with Germany. So it was the so-called end of the Hoxha's plan. And what was even more sad for Czechoslovakia or for Hoxha personally was that also the Czechoslovak Little Entente allies had been broadening not their cooperation with Prague during the second half of the 30s, but instead with Berlin, because Germany could offer them finally the market for their agricultural oversupplies. And there are also another cooperations in other sectors of economy. So in conclusion, I would say that the failure of Hoxha's plan and the German domination in Central Europe at the end of the 30s did not discourage Hoxha from developing these concepts of integration of Central Europe. During the Second World War, he introduced his project of federation in Central Europe in a book published under this title. But after the war, as we know, the region came under subjection of another hegemon. This time it was the hegemon from the east. But despite these failed plans of Hoxha, we can still say that his ideas are alive even today. We can see it today when almost all countries of Hoxha's so-called Central Europe take part in political and economic cooperation in the framework of European Union. So I once again apologize and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hanola. And now we go back to Dr. Straka from the Military History Institute in Prague. Please, Dr. Straka.
Your Excellencies, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to apologize to you for disorientation of a technical kind on my side of our connection. I'm greatly honored to represent on this important international occasion the Military History Institute Prague, a research and museum organization of the Czech Ministry of Defense. I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation. It's a considerable expert challenge to take part in this conference. that has motivated me to try and take a look at the subject of the Little Entente from an angle that isn't usual, but can be, as I assume, useful in many respects. To that effect, I opted for a much globalized approach and perspective. The Little Entente created its own political military strategy, but was at the same time part of a higher overhead strategic concept. I'm alluding to the Grand Military Strategy of France. All three Little Entente countries were tied with France through several essential links of fundamental importance. Same as France, the states of the Little Entente had their basic vital interest in preserving the arrangement of Europe laid down in peace treaties. Individual Little Entente states progressively entered into official ties of different nature with France, which sought to preserve the post-war arrangement in Europe. The alliance from World War I and the political diplomatic overhead structure were another driving factor for all three Little Entente countries to get interconnected with France in the military strategy domain. The French military came out of the last conflict as the strongest and the most experienced military power. They turned to France as the decisive source of inspiration and an example. On the 27th of November 1932, a very extensive analysis of the development of the Little Entente was completed by the General Staff of the French Army. The overall political diplomatic activity of the Little Entente was analyzed in detail. Each member state was evaluated in terms of its internal political development, social, national, and economic situation, and military strategic potential. The document was produced within the Second Bureau, Military Intelligence of the General Staff of the French Army. It was the famous Deuxième Bureau, namely its analytical section, referred to as the Foreign Army section in the French original La Section des Armées étrangères. The motive for conducting the analysis was directly related to the desire of French strategists to update existing military political alliances and adapt them to the international situation, which was at the same time worsening significantly. In general, this concerned primarily the growing sentiment of revisionism, that is the attempt of reverse the post-war system in Europe, and especially the hopeless progress archived at the International Conference for the Reduction of Limitation of Armaments in Geneva. This paper aims to provide a basic understanding of the nature of the information and the views the French strategic analysts based on it. They use it to consider such potential applications of the Little Entente that would go beyond its basic anti-Hungarian focus towards strengthening the Allied front against an initially revisionist and later Nazi Germany. The specialist of the above-mentioned Foreign Army section analyzed the military potential of each of the Little Entente countries according to the standardized indicators, which included human resources for mobilization, that is, in other words, the mobilization potential, the military value of military staff, the material base and military industrial facilities for conducting warfare, and finally, the possibilities of deploying and using the military potential of the Little Entente in the event of a European conflict. The Little Entente formed a powerful political bloc with a total population of 45 million. Its total mobilization potential, that is the number of men capable of performing active military service in wartime, was 6,500,000. This meant that, in theory, there could be a power bloc which would provide the anti-revisionist Allied front with 80 divisions. However, given the limited material base common to the Little Entente as a whole, it was realistically possible to arm and equip no more than approximately 2,800,000 soldiers for field service. French analysts detailed the characteristics of human resources of the various armies allied in the Little Entente as follows. I will paraphrase their main ideas here in a somewhat compressed form. First, let's talk about the Romanian army. The French viewed the Romanians as closest to themselves among all the leading nations of the Little Entente. There was undoubtedly general cultural closeness supported by the notion that both languages are in the same language family. French analysts referred to the Romanian nation as an orientalized Latin culture. The Romanian army adhered very closely to the French school of military art. In practice, this was reflected in the adoption of French military regulations and methods, that is, the overall principles of military art. The Romanian army sent a number of its officers to French military schools every year. French analysts greatly appreciated the sophistication and educational and general cultural level of the Romanian officer corps. In their opinion, the latter had the potential to adapt new and modern military trends in which it showed interest and which were readily accepted. However, in practice, it was limited in this respect by the very weak and qualitatively inadequate material and technical base of the Romanian army. French analysts likened the Romanian soldiers to those of the French army. However, they considered the Romanians to be generally more resilient and more dedicated to the military service of their country. The French general characterized the Romanian army personnel as an overall well-trained, morally, mentally, and physically mature group, and therefore felt they possessed outstanding qualities that could be attributed to them as a whole. In relation to the Yugoslav army, the French analysts came to the following conclusions. The Yugoslav army had a solid officer corps, quality non-commissioned officers, and excellent, energetic, and vigorously trained men. As such, the French considered it ready to wage war. They characterized it as highly ambitious, aiming to archive two supreme objectives. The first was to fulfill the idea of becoming the first, and therefore, in terms of the military, the most valuable instrument of power in the Balkans. The second objective was to archive a position in which it could match the armies of the great powers. The French believed that the Yugoslav army had, in fact, already archived this first objective. However, the archivement of the second objective was prevented by its generally incomplete organization. The Yugoslav Command Corps was generally regarded by the French as a fiercely patriotic, with a deep-seated and extremely pronounced sense of the exclusivity of its mission. However, in terms of the demands of modern soldiering, it hadn't yet reached a desirable level. This was particularly evident in the fact that the Yugoslav Command Corps hadn't yet had time to adapt to the technical innovation and advances that occurred after the World War. Specifically, the Yugoslav Officer Corps hadn't yet archived the desired level of homogeneity in 1930s. Those of its members who were recruited from the former Austro-Hungarian and Montenegrin armies didn't merge into a coherent whole with the Serbs. In spite of the above specifics, the Yugoslav army generally exhibited a high fighting moral, characteristic endurance, unpretentiousness, devotion, and a commitment to sacrifice. Czechoslovakia was somewhat particular within the framework of the Little Entente. It was one of the 7 European countries to which France sent a special military mission very soon after the end of the World War. This mission had been operating in Czechoslovakia since 1919, had extensive powers and influence over the formation of the army, not only in the political technical sense of the meaning, but also in the sense of shaping the military strategy of the state. From the point of view of the quality of the military staff, this mission played an extremely important role. The diversity of origins of the Czech-Slovak Command Corps, which included legionnaires and former members of the Austro-Hungarian army, initially also resulted in a lack of homogeneity. The scope of the French military mission gradually mitigated this unfavorable factor. French analysts had no doubt that the quality of the Czech-Slovak army was gradually increasing, both in terms of its professional qualities and the continuous training and education of all personnel categories of the army, as well as in terms of building up its material and technical base, which was made possible by the highly developed industrial potential of Czechoslovakia. They also appreciated the patriotic spirit of the army. However, overall, they pointed out that its combat value in wartime would depend on who its opponent would be. At 1932 levels, they estimated that it would be able to archive maximum performance against Hungary, whereas they would perform worst against the Soviet Union. They constantly pointed out that for Czechoslovakia, the most serious opponent was and would be not Hungary, but Germany. The conclusions of the French analysts sounded the most critical in relation to the material assumptions of the armies of the Little Entente for waging war. They generally considered their military technical base to be too underdeveloped and contain a number of serious gaps. In particular, the Yugoslav and Romanian armies were characterized by a generally physical and moral obsolescence of armaments and military equipment, as well as by an undesirable diversity. These unfortunate characteristics were associated with the technical categories of arms, that is, especially artillery and air force, as well as signal corps. The air force of the Little Entente armies generally lagged behind modern trends in other armies. Modern means of attack, that is tanks, existed in the first half of the 1930s in only small numbers within the Little Entente armies. In connection with material shortages, the French noted that the high level of interest of Romanian and Yugoslav governments in improving the technical level of their armies by purchasing large-scale imports from abroad. In this sense, they particularly emphasized the personal interest of King Charles II of Romania. This offered an interesting commercial prospect for the Czech, Slovak, and French arms industries in the future. The general evaluation of the development of the Little Entente states and their current military potential allowed the French analysts to express relatively objective opinions regarding the possibilities of deploying these allied armies in the event of a European conflict. Based on the state of affairs in 1932, they concluded that the military strategic potential of the Little Entente could be best be realized under the assumption of a concentric deployment against Hungary, that is, against a commonly anticipated enemy. However, the possibilities of deployment and therefore the chances of success would diminish in any possible off-center use of the military forces of the Little Entente, conceivable through strategic combinations in its immediate surroundings. Overall, it was believed that within its current political, economic, and military organization, the Little Entente Alliance by itself wouldn't survive a defensive struggle against any major countries that might attack it. In a generalized European conflict, it could provide its allies, mainly France and Poland, with considerable support, provided and under the condition that each of the three member countries ensured the development and functionality of its armament in the armaments industry, and that it built a sufficiently efficient railway connection between them for economic trade and the transport of indispensable war material. They concluded by warning that unless these two conditions were met, the Little Entente would risk losing its chances of being able to respond to hostilities in an appropriate and desirable manner in the event of a prolonged war. The set of information and opinions of French intelligence analysts that we have just presented was significant in that it co-created the basis on which France's particular strategic interest was based. Its military strategists promoted an objectively correct interest in reorienting the strategy of the Little Entente. In the middle of the changing security situation in Europe after January 1933, they considered it desirable for the Little Entente to abandon its preoccupation with Hungary and to be able to provide direct assistance to Czechoslovakia, which was in the greatest danger from Germany. Given the complex developments that would occur in the years to follow, this undoubtedly desirable intention wasn't archived. Thank you for your attention, and I hope to meet you personally after this horrible pandemic crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Straka. It was a very interesting analysis. Perhaps we should have focused also on the relations between the members of the Little Entente and France as such. Because in 36, as you know better than me, it was the intention of having a common treaty between Little Entente and France. But at that moment, it was perhaps a little bit late. Each of the members had different views on its own security. In 36, for instance, in Romania, Titulescu was expelled from the government, and the next day the government convened with another foreign minister. But because Titulescu, with his option for the Entente, for the close relationship with France and Britain, was no more acceptable for a new line of foreign policy, Romanian foreign policy. So it was in a way the same in Czechoslovakia. It started several years before Yugoslavia, and the idea of having, as Titulescu tried, and not only him, to convene a joint treaty from the Little Entente with France was no more feasible. But of course, individually, Czechoslovakia had already a treaty with France. Romania had a treaty with France, not a strategic one, but anyway, an important linkage. Were connected, but not as an alliance, but individually, as some countries. Yugoslavia was different in its approach at that time. So I think this type of analysis from the military perspective, and also with the French experience and analysis about what happened inside countries of the Little Entente is very useful, and thank you very much again for being with us and contributing to our conference.
Thank you.
And now the last intervention Professor Vasile Bushkash, member of the Romanian Academy, which will speak about the Little Entente lessons for today and tomorrow. Well, Professor Bushkash, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to be with you and to discuss this topic of Little Entente, because in my opinion, it's not only a history topic, but it's a topic which has a lot of lessons for the future. You know, Paul Lewis, a couple of years ago, wrote that the big problem of countries of Central Europe since 1989 was that these countries were very much oriented towards the past. And immediately Edward Carr replied, I think, he said, and I quote, the better interpretation of the past is coming from the future. Little Entente is a very important historical experience, both for our region and for the Europe. Usually we are talking about military and political alliance, but we have to emphasize that countries of Central Europe and Southeastern Europe understood immediately after the First World War that our region is again a strategic region, how later call it Brzezinski. What does mean strategic region? Is a place, a space which has distinctive characteristics and of course interest, and must fulfill and must implement these policies in a very complex environment, and especially in connection with some power centers. This strategic region is today Central Europe, in my opinion, and we have to learn that not only defensive characteristic of the alliance is important for us, but we have to learn from this historical experience how to manage a transformation process of a group or an organization, sub-regional organization, in order to face the changes of the world. We can remember how Nicolae Titulescu, because you mentioned him, in 1933, said that Little Entente has to become a new type of sub-regional organization, which deals with both military and political issues, but in the same time with economic and cultural. And not only. In Prague in June 1933, Little Entente became a sub-regional organization which emphasized and some integrative approach of all geostrategic, geopolitical, geoeconomical, and geocultural approaches of this period and of the world. Another observation, when leaders of three countries decided to establish a Little Entente, they were not interested only in defensive, but in implementing European and international system. I'm calling this Versailles system, because there were, you know very well, two schools. One school which encouraged the fulfillment of the treaties and of the international treaties, and another one saying that the treaties are not good and we have to revise, or they have to revise, revisionist approach of this. I think it's very important, and today these lessons of these three countries and of Little Entente. And in line with the Briand Memorandum and of some, you know, tryings of the Titulescu and other leaders, they emphasize the importance of three countries and of organization in order to become a sort of, he said, Titulescu said, and I quote, economic unit. And later on, because one of our colleagues remember us, Milan Hoxha, in 1936, Titulescu said that these three countries has to become a union of countries in order to deal with the European integration. It's a very good lesson for what is happening today when we are talking about the future of European integration. The second observation, we have today in our region three groups, important groups, let's say. Very famous one, Visegrad group, Craiova group, which is a very young one, and is, in my opinion, didn't convince yet how important it is to develop a grouping approach, and the three C initiatives. There are another organization or grouping, but these three, in my opinion, are more important. What is, in my opinion, important? These three groups try to imitate other regional organization, this time, not groups, regional organization, like Economic Union of Benelux and Council of Northern Dimension, which are really very successful and perhaps will become in the future very successful. But what we have to do today is, and tomorrow, to think how our region as a strategic region will face new changes of international system. The Little Entente was an answer to a new approach of international system. I mentioned that Versailles system. We are today in a period of restructuring international system, and there are many opinions how new international system will look like. In my opinion, one of the characteristics of new international systems will is underlying the role of some regions. Both Duracell and Hyatt in 90s and 2000 said that we have today, and the new international system will deal with macro region like European Union, ASEAN, NAFTA, former NAFTA, and Mercosur and others, and with meso regions which are part of what I called before in the Brzezinski language, strategic region. What type of regionalism will approach countries of Central Europe and Southeastern Europe is very difficult to say. In my opinion, there are mixture of signals regarding the old regionalism and the new regionalism. I think that the region has to approach more courageously the new regionalism, which is a sort of, let's say, cross-border coalition, which has both informal and formal relationship, but most important is to include and geopolitical and geostrategic interests and issues, and at the same time, coming from the lessons of Little Entente, geoeconomic and geocultural interests. In this perspective, we have to learn that new regionalism is dealing with development, with growth, with good governance, and of course with European integration. All these including or harmonizing in the context of European integration. Will countries of these regions be able to approach such new regionalism, or they'll keep the old-fashioned regionalism? What I think that it's in our interest is to find the way towards the sustainable development of and growth of this region, and underline, it's very important, the role of new regionalism is and to give a great importance to the competitiveness. In my opinion, a new approach of regionalism in our region has to do with competitiveness generator, to become a competitiveness generator, both within the internal market and with global economy. If we'll not succeed to do such a thing, we'll discuss only historical grievance and perhaps some issues which will block cooperation and integration in our region. I want to stop here because, in my opinion, both Little Entente and Balkan Entente learned us and has a lot of very important lessons if we are seeing and we are searching new ways of development in our region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bushkash. It was a very interesting comment, and well, we succeeded in this way to ask relevant questions for nowadays, to start asking ourselves what happened in the interwar period. We asked ourselves if models of collective security can still be built, and of course we ask ourselves if some of the countries in this region can define common threats, or they face themselves with different type of threats, and that's why it's very difficult to come together. But perhaps this is a subject for another conference. That's why thank you very much for bringing at the end of this debate some lessons for today and tomorrow. So now, dear colleagues, I think that we are at the end of our event today, and allow me now to thank Ambassador KAISEROVA and her colleagues in the embassy. Let me also thank well, the distinguished ambassadors which contributed to our debate, and those who in Prague, in Bratislava, in Belgrade, well, helped us with their opinions and comments. Well, I want to thank the Romanian Foreign Ministry for supporting us, including the department, the Archives department, and especially allow me to thank my my colleagues, Professor Dumitru Preda, who was well, the brain, the heart, the muscles of this conference, being in touch with the embassies and organizing in an excellent way intellectually this conference. I want to thank also Stefan Florescu, who let us communicate among us, but also with friends from abroad. Adina Renza for contributing to organizing well, the exhibition, and all the other friends who are now here or who are well, watching our debate. I hope that this was an interesting experience for all of us. And let's continue with some other subjects. That's why, once again, I thank you all, and I wish you Merry Christmas, good health, and well, a good end of this year. Perhaps less pandemic restrictions next year, and more events of this kind, perhaps in physical contact as much as possible. Once again, thank you very much to you all, and let's meet again for some other subjects. Thank you.
Thank you. And goodbye.